place. The kids run up here, you see, before Gurinder, right? And I was thinking, oh my God, I hope they don't start playing around with the microphones and the lights. Because kids, it looks tempting as you're a kid. If you're a kid and you see all this stuff around, you can't see it obviously, but they haven't broken anything and it's working.
That's okay. That's the main thing. In fact, if I come around, I might start playing around with the stuff there.
Yeah, you're allowed. You're allowed. But but Gurinder, look, thank you very much for coming on the show. I've been meaning to get you on for years. Literally years, right? Which is a history book in itself, but we never quite managed to make it happen. But now with COVID and online interviews and this kind of virtual chats that we have, we thought we'd get together and also to talk about your book and also about you yourself as well. You know, we can sometimes get obsessed about talking about the book and we forget the person behind the book and what they've done and how they've got to this stage. So just welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Sat. Like you said, it's been a long time. I think it's been many years when we've been trying to get together. So, opportunity is knocking on the door, as they say. So, yeah, thank you for having me. And let's get into a great discussion today. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, so your book, I've got your book. I want people watching on YouTube and listening to know that I have actually got your book, right? And I am reading it and I'm just... partly halfway through, I would say. It is a fantastic book, honestly. And I know we spoke on the phone, didn't we? And you could tell I was quite excited because I just read it that morning. And I did buy it, by the way. I want everyone else to know that. I did buy this book because one thing, it's about supporting you and your work as well. You know, we can't get ahead in life. We need money, obviously, to do things that we want to do, right? To make these projects. So for anyone listening who's thinking about getting the book, go out and buy it, definitely, for a start. And because Gurinder never sent me a free copy, did you?
I think the postal system hasn't been too great during the COVID.
Yeah, it's in the post. It's in the post. Let's put it there. And also, I want to tell everyone, Gurinder Singh Mann, we're not related, are we? Because I know some people will say we're not, but we are neighbours. We found out, obviously.
Absolutely, and it was really interesting because we've been talking, off and on for some years, and it was only recently that we realised that, we're kind of from neighbouring villages as well. And sometimes people who share a surname predominantly think that they may be related, but even with some of the surname that I've got, like the name Mann, for instance, it's interesting that how many don't live nearby where traditionally the family comes from. So it's been great to actually realise that, we are technically neighbours, or Bindus, as you want to call it, from the Punjab, really.
Yeah, and you very kindly sent me a map as well, didn't you? Of some historic locations around where I live.
Yeah, I think the key thing has been, because we're talking about the Hoshiarpur area now, and interesting, Hoshiarpur doesn't really get counted too many times when we look about Sikh history, for instance, but it has played a pivotal part in the Punjab's history and the Sikhs' history as well. And, it's definitely an area I want to tap into in the future a lot more, for instance. And as part of that, I will give you some examples of that later on in the show as well. So I've got a little really interesting bit regards Hoshiarpur, not too far from where our forefathers come from, really.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I'm excited about that, and but we'll make it inclusive to everyone else who's not a Mann, and so it's not just about me and you, but we can sit here and talk about this book, the British and the Sikhs, right? But I want to talk a little bit about you before we begin. I want to talk about the man behind the book, right? So why history, Gurinder? Why history for you?
I think it's, as a young child, I think I was kind of growing up with always watching the news as well. And it's really interesting. Even now, I'm always watching the news. I'm not really into politics per se as much but I still enjoy watching and reading about politics. But there has to be some kind of impetus. What leads an event to lead to another event? And for me, it's always been about some historical events which lead to other events. And what ramifications do they have? Not just 5 years, 10 years. These ramifications could be 100 or even thousands of years later as well. So, certain pivotal points in history change the framework and the makeup of mankind, essentially. and womankind. And, you know, it's really important to have a little bit of a handle of what our historical place is around the world. I mean, as human beings first, as individuals, and then if we break ourselves down into whether it's religion or a certain area of the world as well. So for me, I always grew up reading widely, say, for instance, on the Egyptians, for instance. I was very, very fascinated to actually learn about the pyramids, for instance. I've been to the pyramids itself as well. And, you know, it's very, very interesting. And, you know, I was really interested to learn about South American religions, older religions, going back to, say, Christianity and before as well. And looking at the Middle East as well, looking at some of the religions that most people don't even talk about, like Zoroastrianism, for instance, you know, some of the Buddhist offshoots as well, Taoism, for instance, and, you know, the history of these religions are just as fascinating as the practices or praxis of these religions as well. And again, it tells you a lot about mankind. It tells you about where we've come from, but it also tells you about where we can go as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And they say that you should learn from history, and, you know, looking at the news these days, I don't sometimes think we do, and we kind of make the same mistakes and same political moves. It's always all about territory and the other. And look, reading your book as well, it was, you know, the other. It depends whose perspective you're looking at. The other could be the British, but the British thought that the Sikhs were the other. You know, there's that cultural clash, a religious clash, you know, ideologies, and that happens today as well. It's still going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things that we should be learning from the past, if that makes sense. Whilst we may say the world has moved on technologically, but interestingly, every period of life, or every period, if we go backwards, has had technological improvements. But that doesn't necessarily mean mankind has actually moved forward as well. If that makes sense. Because remember reading a book on Buddhism, and it was all about technological advances of the 50 years, but it says how much has mankind actually really moved on in terms of being human, you know, being kind to their common folk, for instance, you know, not creating wars, for instance, not being in the negative. And, you know, it's one of these paradigms where in this day and age, technology is advancing at the most rapid stage in all our lives, you know, throughout mankind. And some people have got disconnected as well. You know, there's disconnect with technology, but there's a disconnect with people as well. Because whilst technology is making you connected with people, it's also making you disconnected as well. So the idea is that, you know, when you do actually have powers, you have countries, for instance, and when you talk about the other, it depends on what this other is. And now in this day and age, are we talking about people who are technologically suave, or the non-technologist minded people, or are we talking about countries who can kind of mine technology to a point where the others are less technologically or deficient, if that makes sense? So there's different wars taking place, whereas before, you know, it could have been very military and the strikes were different. Now it's all economic, it's computerized, and wars are taking place right now, right in front of your nose, and you wouldn't even know it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, without doubt, there's a data war going on about which countries have the most data on their citizens, and not only their own citizens, but other citizens as well. And yeah, so it's very interesting how we've progressed or not progressed, whichever way you want to look at it. And I think that's kind of your fascination, right, with history, and why you delved into it. And you talked about the Egyptians and was it the Mayans as well, and which are fantastic. And some of their technologies they had for that time was amazing, right? So if you look at the pyramids, are you kind of telling me the pyramids weren't made by aliens?
Well, you know,
it's not in your book. It's not in your book.
They weren't made by aliens. And it's really interesting because, you know, when it comes to history as well, there's all these kind of theories about, you know, Z and Y. And, you know, you can turn on to TV every week and there'll be another theory of how the pyramids were made. I mean, the key thing I think is when we do go back in history, you'll actually find, and this is what I've always found fascinating, is if something has been invented in a certain part of the world, you've got to remember, information traveled very slowly, people traveled very rarely. So even if you invented something, you wouldn't even know about it. So you could actually have an invention, or a civilization could have had some types of technology, but eventually that could have died with them as well. And then X amount of years later, it's redeveloped in a different fashion, if that makes sense. And the interesting thing that I've always that made me kind of think is about things like travel, for instance, as well. You know, about the airplanes, for instance. And, you know, when you look at inventions, and you look at the East sometimes as well, sometimes the East and the way they've developed certain things do not get figured, say, in when it comes to the West. So it's like, this person invented this person invented this. But when you go back even deeper, you'll find that other civilizations or other kind of groups have had their finger in terms of inventing stuff, but maybe not in terms of a mass market in the way maybe the West sometimes kind of associates themselves with actually developing stroke inventing something.
Yeah. So history is made by the people that write it.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
this is the
key case, right? So and you know, so for you, I see your love for history is very clear. Even talking to you here, you know, you're really passionate about it, you know. And so as you're growing up as a kid, was that your dream? I want to be a historian, or did you not even know what a historian was at that time?
I don't think it was a case of actually knowing what a historian is per se. I think it's more a case of actually just being a culture vulture is the word I would use, basically.
Yeah.
So you're just kind of being a sponge, basically. You're just reading and reading and reading and reading. This is like non-stop. And if someone said to me, have you stopped reading? And the answer is no. I'm probably reading more now than I've probably done even when I was a kid, for instance. It's like, you're around my house, it's like a book here, book there, book everywhere. And it's like, I think for me, it's always been about, trying to actually understand, because there's a minefield of information out there. People think now in the modern day of the internet in terms of how information is accessible. But sometimes when you're looking for one bit of information, you may need to read 50 books. You may even need to travel 1,000 miles just to find that one bit of information. So therefore, the more widely you read, if that bit of information is not current now, hopefully it stays in your head and it will be current when you're doing a future project, or you may be doing something which kind of it ties in with in a later years. And I've done that for decades. So for me, there may be something I discovered years ago. There's no kind of project there's no actual big reason to actually kind of celebrate it until it's actually done in a packaged way, and where, it gets maximum mileage as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned, sometimes you have to travel thousands of miles away just for that one piece of evidence. And that's what you do. You're, for people listening and watching, you don't just write these books. You actually do travel in the field, and I've seen photographs of you at specific locations, important locations, primarily for this book as well, the British Sikhs, and so you put the legwork in, right? You're not just sitting in a library, with your head in a book. You're actually out there, and so do you enjoy that aspect as well? You want to physically see these places?
Absolutely, and I think there's no substitute for that either. And I always learned since day one, where possible, try and go to the physical place where, I don't know, certain battles taken place, where, say, maybe a Gurdwara is located. Because sometimes what can happen is you'll find more about actually visiting the actual location, maybe speaking with the villagers, for instance, maybe going to the next village who may know more about the village where something's actually taking place, which has always been the case as well. Actually taking photography, and then, as much as I probably didn't do this in the past, I do a lot more in terms of geography now as well, looking at maps, for instance, a lot more in details, and then kind of making some kind of assessments of that. But for me, it's been very much paramount. So whilst I was writing this book, for instance, I went to Delhi, for instance, and looked at some of the areas where Bhangra Singh, and we'll talk about Bhangra Singh later on in terms of the Gurdwaras that he formulated. But whilst I was doing that, I found other things as well. And I think that's the key thing. It's like, when I was looking at the Anglo-Sikh Wars, for instance, when I went to the battlefields of the Anglo-Sikh War, say Mudki, Firozshah, Sabrawal, for instance. There's so much other little information which is picked up by just going to these places and venues, and it's absolutely fascinating. I think they can never be a substitute of being a field scholar. Unfortunately, I didn't want to follow what other people were doing in terms of just being getting books from the library, looking at documents only. That is all supporting. All of that has to be packaged right. It has to be, say, from, I don't know, the British Library, for instance, having conversations with other scholars, for instance, looking at relics and artifacts, for instance, wherever they be, whether in the UK or whether they be in the Punjab, and then actually going out in the field as well, because you've got to have that sense of feeling, for instance. And I'll give you a really great example, for instance. When we talk about Guru Gobind Singh and the battles he's fought, for instance, I went to the location of where the Battle of Bagani Sahib took place, and it's a fascinating place, and this is a very, very great location which oversees where this particular battle took place. And you actually stand there, and just by actually maybe reciting parts of the scriptures which Guru Gobind Singh wrote, and actually being in that location, you get that sense of feeling just by being in that particular location.
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine that must have been almost overwhelming as well, because I remember I spoke to you about this on the phone, and I said, when I go to my local Gurdwara with my family, and I see the pictures on the walls, and sometimes my kids are getting a bit older now, they're asking me, what's this picture about? And you see someone with their head being scalped off and in boiling water, and as the kids would see, like, two children being put into a wall, and they're asking me questions, and shamedly, I don't really know the stories behind it. I've been told by my parents to an extent, but basically this is what's happening, and but not why it's happened. How did it get to this situation? Why is someone being boiled in water, and what's the sort of political implications of this, and what were the decisions made? And that's kind of what your book deals with as well, right? And that's what I found really fascinating. There's experts in it where Guru Gobind Singh's injured, and there's a doctor that attends him, and we're not sure, are we, if it's a British doctor or a European doctor. And I found that fascinating, just to make it more real, and just to remember that there was an actual real person. Guru Gobind Singh was around, walking around, talking, leading people, and even just by reading this book, it just made it more real for me. I don't know how you felt to actually go to these locations. Must have been just absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah, I think, like I said, because I have been doing this for many years, but still to this day, if there's a new location I'm going to, I will always, look at it as being somewhere fresh. There's never been a time when I've gone somewhere and said, "Oh, this just looks like the other place." There's no such thing as that. Each place brings in a different kind of narrative, brings in different kind of stories as well. And just going back to your particular story about when we had these images on the Gurdwaras, for instance, the idea behind the Gurdwara was always about kind of a little bit of a shock and awe kind of tactic, to actually say, this is what the Afghans have done to the Sikhs, the Mughals have done to the Sikhs. And what happens is it portrays your thinking to think that these people are bad and this will happen. And what's interesting is you don't get that narrative in those pictures when I was going to the Gurdwara as to what it actually means, like you said. So there were very barbaric ways in which the Sikhs were killed, for instance. There was a bounty placed on Sikhs' heads, for instance. But out of any of those pictures, I rarely actually saw when the Sikhs actually fought back and actually did something which stopped this from happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And this is what we talk about when we talk about the Sikh missiles, the Confederacy in so many words. And I think this book is about almost going back and saying, well, really, those pictures are represented in this book because I have got people like Baba Bagil Singh, you know, from the Gurinder Singh missile on the cover, because there's individuals like him and other missile leaders which changed the way in which or how the Sikhs were actually affected by these invasions. So if we talk about the invasion by Ahmed Shah Abdali, for instance, this was just invasion after invasion after invasion. And the brunt of it was actually, I mean, if you look at, say, the Battle of Panipat in 1761, the Marathas were actually decimated, completely decimated. And, you know, all these groups around India are being obliterated. And what the Sikhs were doing was that they were small in number, but they used to pick off parts of the army. So once the Afghans were retreating, they would pick off the baggage train, for instance. They would pick off the end of an actual attack. And in that way, that made the Sikhs slightly superior in a sense, because their military tactics were more effective to a point where, you know, people like Abdali, for instance, gave up in the end, said, I can't deal with these people anymore because their shock and awe tactics are just infuriating me. I mean, don't get me wrong, there was some kind of frontal battles as well, but not as much, because the numbers of the Afghans, because they sided with the local Mughals as well, say in Lahore and other places, the numbers were too many compared with the Sikhs. But the Sikhs actually were very wise in their tactics, they were wise in their military strategy, and that is why we are still here today, and we can live our lives due to the wise decisions of these Sikh missile leaders. But you weren't getting that from these pictures, if that makes sense, when I was growing up. So it takes a bit of time to make sense of these kind of things and the actual historic narratives which come out from these images, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting because one of the sections in your book talks about some of their tactics, and I've always thought, just purely just what I thought, because I thought, you know, the Sikhs were like kind of like guerrilla warfare, you know, but they weren't just that. You know, they did have elements of that. They were actually very well organized, you know, in battalions, and, you know, they were organized, you know, and one of their tactics was to attack and retreat, you know, and no one had seen that before. So like you said, they were shocked. They couldn't handle that. They didn't understand. So they were fairly advanced for their tactical nous, you know, and like you said, the missiles were they were feared. And also the British are like an overarching big brother, right? They're just watching this go on, and they don't get involved until certain points. And they're so cunning; it's unbelievable, because they kind of let them fight each other, and they think, "Well, just sit back and watch." But when the Sikhs started getting bigger and bigger, that's when they step in. They start their sort of British diplomacy first by giving them gifts and courting favor with them. But when it got too much for them, they'll start wars with them, right? That was very interesting to me as well, you know, and it kind of tells you how the empire grew so big, because I think that tactic for them probably worked around the world as well. You know, they would let the natives get on with it, and but it was an eye-opener, definitely. And you're right about looking at them pictures. But what was the backstory? And did the Sikhs just sit back and take this all? No, they didn't actually. They actually did quite a lot. And I was looking at some of the numbers of the missiles, you know. I mean, we're talking about 7,000 horsemen, you know, 6,000 archery. You know, it goes on and on and on, you know. We're talking about big numbers, thousands upon thousands. I mean, that must have been an awe-inspiring view to have them all on horseback, you know, ready to do battle. I mean, some of these facts and figures, where did you come across these? Were these like in the British Library, or how did your research come about?
So it's interesting because the whole idea of the missile period has been underrepresented. I think it's this idea of Guru Gobind Singh, Banda Singh Bahadur, then it goes quiet, and then it's Ranjit Singh, and this whole massive period from the 1720s onwards to about 1800 is kind of all missing. through a lot of narratives, for instance. So I wanted to go back to kind of just start the ball rolling in terms of who the Sikh missals were. And quite rightly, looking at the numbers as well in terms of how many horse they could muster, how many people they could get in the field. And there is estimated figures as well. Obviously, we do have many British accounts in terms of the numbers. Some are widely exaggerated, for instance. So we do actually have the books of British servicemen from the East India Company who estimated the number of Sikhs and the number of missiles that were there as well. So I've got about 4 or 5 different accounts of those particular numbers, and I've kind of averaged them out as well, if that makes sense. But the key thing was this: after Guru Gobind Singh's time, and even after Banda Singh Bahadur, who plays a really pivotal point in Sikh history, it was almost kind of like a bit of a lull. And then we have these new leaders like Nawab Kapoor Singh, who has to actually, like I said, have to have some kind of organizational structure to the bands, so to speak, bands of warriors. And, these missiles are now started being created. So whilst Nawab Kapoor Singh is the kind of the initiator, he does pass on this mantle to Jassa Singh Ahluwalia, who actually is the head of the Buddha Dal, who's considered the older warriors, and the Tarna Dal, which are the younger warriors. So they're kind of split up in terms of their roles and responsibilities. And there is some interesting books that we do, and information that has come throughout the ages in terms of the numbers, for instance. I mean, Panth Prakash by Ratan Singh Pangu is a very, very interesting text which talks about the missile period as well. Luckily for me, I've also been able to tap into Persian sources as well. I've been able to tap into a lot of eyewitness accounts by the Afghans and the Mughals as well as to what was taking place during that time as well. So it's, whilst I've taken parts of this for the British and the Sikhs book, I've got a lot of material for some other project in the future as well regarding the Sikh missiles. And in fact, the amount of information I've found is absolutely fascinating, because now I'm getting to understand a lot more in terms of how, like you said, the British were like, just watching to see what's taking place. And, they say it quite rightly. They say, look, if it is not for the Sikhs, then Abdali is going to, kind of wipe out all of India, and they're going to probably wipe out us as well, as in the British. So in a way, as long as the Sikhs don't make any bargain with Abdali, we're loving the Sikhs in terms of what they're doing. So they kind of respected them in terms of what they were doing as a warrior group. But like you said, later on is when the kind of, the actual, the communication level changes as and when the Sikhs are getting stronger and stronger throughout the 18th century.
Yeah, it was a point of, when they were helpful to the British, they were great, but they could see their power gaining and their numbers and their strength, and then they had to step in as well. I mean, these kind of stories and history I wish I'd read when I was at school, because we used to read about the Treaty of Versailles, when the World War II started, when it ended, that kind of stuff. And even the Egyptians, and we used to learn, but never about Sikh history, and never even having an opportunity to learn about it, but hopefully things like this will change. And I hope a book like this is in school libraries, because it's fantastic. And the chapters are short, a very snappy read, because I think some people get wary. I think we live in a world where attention spans are very short, and but for people listening, I would say the chapters are very short and quick, so you can dip in and out of the book. Would you agree? And it's not a big tome, where you have to spend hours and hours and hours and days and weeks reading it, which I found really helpful, because with a family as well, I could dip into it, stop and go back into it. So for yourself, did you purposely keep it small, or was it a reason behind that?
Yeah, I think as I've written several books now, I mean, my first book was Dasan Granth Question and Answers, and that was 50 questions and 50 answers. And it was a really good read, should I say. Very easy. Most people really enjoyed reading it, and it serves a purpose. This book, which I'll just kind of bring up here as well, The Granth of Guru Gobind Singh. Okay, so that one was published by Oxford University. And that is very academic, and that serves a purpose as well.
Mm.
And it gets a different kind of crowd actually possibly reading that book. This particular book has been ongoing for many years. I've been trying to release this book for maybe, I don't know, 7-8 years, for instance. So
Wow.
a lot of work which I've done in the past and packaged it up with a lot of new information as well. But what I wanted to do was to actually, because if we're covering a span of 200 years, it's either got to be an encyclopedia, or either it's got to be a really good read which actually encapsulates 200 years in very snappy and short points. And as much as we say it's short, but the footnotes go into detail about nearly every single person in the book. So if it's an East India Company officer, you'll learn something about them. If it's about, Sikh warriors, for instance, you'll know something extra. And that is what I want to do. Like the main text is always, about the punchy kind of information, the kind of historical significance of what the Sikhs did. But the actual footnotes goes into a lot more details, which gives people wider reading in terms of where they can go to for further information. And that's the whole idea behind footnotes.
Yeah, and I think it works because there was parts I read and I thought, oh, I'd love to know a bit more. And the footnotes do direct you to where you can go if you want to, further your reading on these subjects. And I just found it fascinating. And also, it like the Sikh armies weren't just, they didn't just have a bow and arrow and off they went. They were a lot more organized than that. They were given a flag and a drum, and certain sections were told, there you go, there's your flag and drum, and off you go, and you look after that area. But the overall organization of it, like you said, the missiles, I think they're such an important, key, integral part to our Sikh history that we don't know about, let alone forgotten about. We just didn't know. And it's from Banda Singh Bahadur was a pivotal point, I think, when he passed away, that there was a lull. And also I think that the motivation of the Sikhs, it dropped because he was such a key pivotal figure. The morale of the Sikhs was at a low point, and so it took these other gentlemen and women, actually, which was very interesting. There's some key female characters in history there that play big parts, and I found that very fascinating. Again, we don't talk about that, do we? We don't even know their names.
I think, again, going back to this whole period, basically, it's kind of had this underrepresentation because most people just don't know anything about it. It's just either the information's not there, either people are unclear as to how to actually explain that period. But more importantly, I think it's this idea that, maybe there's something which they can't explain, if that makes sense. I know it sounds really weird in that context, but if we look at the Sikhs during that time, we're coming from a period of actually where the Mughals are in power throughout, or Hindustan, if you want to call it. And what we have is then another wave of attackers called the Afghans. And unfortunately, even our people, the Sikhs, have forgotten that it was mainly the Afghans which we had a problem with. Sometimes, going back to this images of what we saw in the Gurdwaras, it's always Mughals did this, Mughals did this, Mughals did this. So in the same way that the British have done this, the British have done this. But history is a bit more complex, essentially. And it's, it's a narrative of different individuals, like we said at the start, different armies, for instance. And if we've not even even if we don't know the names of these Sikh generals, how are we even ever going to get to know the names of the women folk who were standing shoulder to shoulder with the Khalsa armies as well? So, it just shows you how much detail gets eroded over time because, we don't even know the basic facts, let alone know the intricacies of what was taking place then.
Yeah, I mean, just not knowing like the generals, you're absolutely right. Even I've just thought of that now as you're speaking to me. We could name generals of maybe the First World War, Second World War, and but not for our own generals who amazingly, who grew the British Empire, the Sikh Empire, against the backdrop of the British Empire, probably one of the greatest empires in history, which is debatable. Obviously, there's other ones as well. But for us, I mean, I just found it fascinating, and it's a book that's made me want to learn more. And I think I hope that's was one of your dreams of writing this book, for people to read it and want to learn more about this.
I think since day one, my kind of MO has always been, once you've seen my lecture, once you've read my book, once you've seen some kind of digital showcase I've done, it's not just for that half an hour, it's not for that 45 minutes, it's not for that hour. You should be going back and doing some research yourself. I've always said that since day one. It's not about me effectively or per se. It should be about empowerment as well. So just like the Sikhs were empowering other Sikhs during every part of history, now I'm trying to make history as well. I'm trying to empower other people to actually read the book and learn more as well. And that's, that is what everyone should be doing. It's not about the selling of books. It's not about making your name great. If you're doing all of that, your name will go down in history anyway. But it's all about making sure that we're not getting left behind as a group, left behind in terms of the history. The Sikhs are not getting left behind because they can't name a couple of generals. The Sikhs are not getting left behind because they don't know what took place during the Sikh Empire, for instance. So, all these leads to the later narratives of, for instance, I don't know, the annexation of Punjab, the employment of Sikhs in British Indian Army, Jallianwala Bagh, partition, etc., and even 1984. But even before you get to all of those areas, you should have this kind of deep connected rootness, basically the root of where everything has come from. And unless we get this grip on the 18th century and understand what these Sikh warriors were trying to do, then it kind of, and even geographically, because remember, Punjab has been split up many, many times. And it's really important to understand the geographical boundaries. And it's really important because sometimes we always talk about the Punjab, but what is the actual Punjab technically? And, in my book, I've done a great map which shows where the missiles were actually spread out. And, we're going to the parts of parts of Pakistan, which is, near the borders of Afghanistan, all the way towards Delhi. And then I've got like spots which shows you where the Sikh missiles are dominating all the way. So if you look at it from from the river's point of view, we're talking about the river Sutlej at one point, we're talking about the river Jamna, and then we're talking about the river Ganga or the Ganges. And these are thousands of miles away. We normally sometimes put ourselves as Sikhs in a little pot and say, this is the Punjab and that's what Sikhs are about. My book is challenging that notion and that narrative by saying, no, it's not about that. It's more about actually wherever the Sikhs went, this is what they did, or this is the impact they had. And I think we need to go back to the impact and the actual kind of, all right, we're talking about it in terms of military tactics, but also about the bravery, but also what they did when they were like a couple of thousand miles away from their homes, for instance, a couple of hundreds of miles away from their homes. What did that actually mean? And what impact did it have? And this is the key thing in the history of India and say the 18th century, for instance. They talk about the Marathas, they talk about the Rohillas, they talk about the Mughals and the East India Company. And the Sikhs, again, are getting left out because we don't know how to actually kind of describe our role. And hence, even leading up to why I have Baba Bagil Singh on the cover of this particular book.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you did mention that to me. There's a reason he's on there, and for people watching and listening, just explain, the reason for having him on the cover. And the cover actually, there's a story within the cover, right? And if you look deep into it, it's not just the cover, right? If you look at the background and the foreground, there's certain elements in there. Do you mind describing the cover to people?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it's behind me anyway, but essentially, the key thing was this is not a cover made just on a whim. It was actually it's a historical kind of basis behind the actual cover. So I'll tell you the history side first. So in 1765 onwards, the power of the missile is increasing year by year. You get to about 1780s, and around about 1783, the Sikh missiles actually launched an attack on Delhi itself. There had already been skirmishes around Delhi prior to 1783, but this is what we would call the main attack by the Sikh missiles on Delhi. So we have Jassa Singh Ahluwalia and Baghel Singh, we have Jassa Singh Ramgarhia, we have other missiles as well. But this attack of between 30 to 40,000 Khalsa attacked Delhi, and the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II that's it. He's kind of negated to a point that he doesn't know what to do. The Sikhs actually climb into what we call the Divani Arm. It's the kind of like the royal place of the Mughals. And Jassa Singh Ahluwalia almost fulfills a prophecy from the days of Nawab Kapoor Singh that the Khalsa will have sovereignty, and therefore Jassa Singh Ahluwalia does fulfill that in the sense that he becomes, he sits on the seat of Delhi, for instance. And when they say Raj Karuga Khalsa, this is what they were talking about in one sense, in terms of the Sikhs actually dominated Delhi. But what they didn't do was they actually took over Delhi. They didn't actually get rid of the Mughal emperor. They negotiated a treaty, and the key person regarding that was Baba Baghel Singh. So Baghel Singh negotiated the treaty, and again, it wasn't necessarily with Shah Alam, but Shah Alam actually gave the instructions to someone called Begum Samaru, who was a female leader of a place called Sardana, which is north of Delhi. So again, just shows you these relationships are taking place between the Sikhs, and even so the Sikhs are negotiating with the woman female leader. So it's interesting. So it brings in this narrative that Baghel Singh negotiates the building of several gurdwaras around Delhi, and he also gets taxation rights as well. So in the 18th century, the Sikhs had something called Rakhi, which was what we call protection money, blanket money, for instance. And what it means is that if you take over an area, people would pay this kind of money. So Delhi had to pay a certain percentage of taxation to the Sikhs from 1783 onwards. And Baghel Singh always received it. It's never a case that even when there were other battles with the Sikhs and the Mughals and the Afghans and all the other groups, he constantly received those kind of what we call octroi duties, so to speak. So the Sikhs did something really, really absolutely fantastic. After all the persecution from the Mughals and the Afghans, they took over Delhi. And unfortunately, it's it's not a very, very recognized event even now. And even, I think it was maybe in the last 6-7 years that they've started celebrating it at Delhi as Delhi Fateh Divas, okay? So the victory over Delhi Day, essentially. So that's become only recent. So it just shows you how much we're still lagging behind in terms of commemorating an event like this. So for me, it was like, okay, well, some people have heard of Jassa Singh Ramgarhia, some people have heard of Jassa Singh Ahluwalia, and maybe some of the other missiles. But when it came to Baghel Singh, all we hear about is, okay, he did this, he did that. I wanted to do something different and have him on the cover. So what the cover actually portrays, if I just grab the book and if you can just see it. So what the cover actually portrays is Baghel Singh and the Khalsa, and behind them is
I'll put a picture up, Gurinder. Don't worry.
That's okay.
I'll put a picture up.
We've got the Red Fort behind Baghel Singh, and what's going on is that the Red Fort is smouldering. But in the corner, the right-hand corner of the book, we have the British there. And we're like thinking, well, what are they involved for there? But because it was that particular moment when the British actually started taking notice the most during the 18th century. At that point, it was like, well, now the Sikhs have taken over Delhi. We're trying to take over Delhi, and I've got another group to contend with. Okay, whilst they've dealt with Delhi and the Afghans, now they're conquering Delhi, and they're coming up to our borders to a place called Anupsha, which was a British protectorate. And then it's like, well, what's next? And that's why the cover, the British and the Sikhs, for me, the story actually starts from that particular point. It starts earlier, but that is the kind of pivotal kind of story I wanted to portray with this particular cover, essentially.
Yeah, fantastic. You explained that fantastically well, because that is the crux of what I was mentioning earlier, where the British were watching before, but it's got to a point where they were watching and realize they're on their doorstep now, and they're worried about what the Sikhs are going to do next. And that's where the relationship starts to change. The dynamics of power begin to, or the levers of power begin to push against each other. And that's what I mean. It's so fascinating, and it really puts into context the reasons these things happen. And I'd be honest, I'd never heard of this general's name before. Maybe I'm not that well read, but I would say there's a lot of people that I know that probably don't know the general's name either. And so he's a pivotal character in history for Sikhs. And then when you do look at the cover again, it opens up, and it really, you think, wow, okay, I understand. And like you said, the British are there just watching. Like Big Brother. They're like the little bad characters in the back of in a film.
Well, it's interesting because I didn't want to actually portray anyone to be positive or negative.
No.
In this book, it's more about narratives, and it's more about actually what is the relationship between certain groups. And so by having the British in the corner, it wasn't to actually not even to demean them. It was more about this picture is more about making you think, well, what is the power plays taking place during this time, and what does take place from that point as well. So it's more like a picture paints 1,000 words. I think this picture paints 2,000 words at least.
At least, definitely. And it's a great picture, by the way, as well. To whoever designed the picture, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it was Gurinder Singh Sana from Birmingham. So massive kudos goes out to Gurinder Singh from Birmingham. He's a great artist. He does a lot of work in this similar kind of fashion. He's done quite a lot of artistic works on Guru Gobind Singh, the Gurus, for instance. And when we were talking, I just gave him a bit of license in terms of how we should portray it. He knew the key facts. I'd explained the key facts to him, and he came up with an absolutely fascinating kind of portrait of, including the Khalsa, very, especially in terms of actually portraying themselves as Nihangs as well. So, that was a very, very key message of this kind of image, essentially.
Yeah, you mentioned the Nihangs as well, because they're dotted throughout the book, and there's always mentions of them, And I think one of the letters written by I think he's a British general, and he writes back to the Empire, and he talks about him when he first met a Nihang warrior, and he's kind of scared, isn't he? Because he looks at this person, his appearance, and he sees his sword and and his turban, he's big tall turban, and he's kind of in awe of him, and he literally writes that down, doesn't he, back to his generals back in England, and he says, look, I've met these people and they seem quite aggressive. Which was making me laugh when I read that.
Well, it's interesting because the Nihangs were a different kettle of fish. I mean, all right, let's just explain a little bit more as well. So you've got the Buddha Dal and the Dharna Dal were technically all Nihangs, essentially. And what happens is during the 1800 period as well, we have people like Akali Phula Singh, another famous Nihang as well. And what happens is that the descriptions of the Sikhs, especially when it comes to the Nihangs, are very, very vibrant, because you've got the turbans, you've got the quoits in the turbans, they're wearing blue, and they're shastadari, which means they're just full of shastras. So you've got a gun, you've got a punch dagger called a qatar, you've got quoits around your neck. You're a walking army. So one Khalsa is exactly what Guru Gobind Singh was talking about, Sawa Lakh. Yeah, so that's what it was all about. So I think it represents of what the Sikhs were about in the 18th century, and to some extent the 19th century as well, in terms of what one Khalsa actually meant. So a one-man walking army, or even a one-man walking woman army, wasn't actually too different from the actual truth.
Yeah, very fascinating. I mean, I really enjoyed that, and it's strange because sometimes your book, one of the main things I like about your book, you don't put your theories as such down. You don't say this is what I think happened. You kind of say these are the facts, and we can't we don't have a definitive answer, is what you put in some of your paragraphs. We don't know one way or the other, but what could have potentially happened is this. And I like you kept it open, and you want the reader to either make an educated decision themselves, or look further into it to see if they can understand what actually happened. Because sometimes with certain books, it's kind of the author's opinion on things. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think scholarship, what I really want to do since day one. I mean, we're not even talking about when I started. I started in 1997,
Yeah.
actually. And, I did my MA in South Asian religions, finished that in 2001. And for me, it was always about backing up your information. So, if you've got, like I said, we talked about footnotes earlier on. So if I'm backing up something, a theory on a Sikh manuscript, for instance, I'm not looking for one bit of information. I'm trying to look for 5 bits of information for that paragraph where possible. And that's why the book on the Dasam Granth, the Granth of Guru Gobind Singh, was so kind of successful, in the sense that the methodology employed was, looking at Sikh manuscripts, looking at Sikh Ityas or Sikh history, looking at locations, looking at Sikh relics and artifacts, going out into the field. Very similar with this book as well, but that one was had to be undertaken to such an nth degree, because obviously, some of the there being a debate on the text called the Dasam Granth. But the key point was, you have to back it up, to back your sources up, because it's then available for academic scrutiny. And in the same way with this particular book, I'm using a wide range of sources as well. I mean, whilst it is the British and the Sikhs, and there's a lot of British sources, I've got Sikh sources and I've got Persian sources in there as well. And I think the key thing is that that's why it's important to be a field scholar, because the field scholarship adds to the written scholarship, and then you combine it together, and that is when you get some real history coming out of it.
Yeah. With your passion for history, and you've got so much to choose from yet. There's so much in history that you can sink your teeth into. You sometimes get overwhelmed thinking, I want to do a bit of that. I want to do a bit of that. I want to look into that. And how do you make your decisions about what you're going to concentrate on? Because anyone who writes a book, I mean, it's not any small undertaking at all to write a book. I mean, not only the actual physical part of writing a book, I mean, mentally it must be exhausting at times. You're doing a lot of research, you're on the field as well. So sometimes people can see a book as the end product, but what blood, sweat and tears have literally gone into this. I know how books are, created. And so how do you decide on your subject? Because once you start, it's going to overwhelm your life, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think because I've been doing this for nearly 2 decades now, I've got a lot of material to choose from, which is a good thing. And like I said earlier, there's a lot of research which I've probably parked to a point where I'm going to do something with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think this British and the Sikhs book was about an overriding kind of overarching history of various groups, for instance, which will now lead into possibly other books I'm writing. It could be the Sikh missiles, could be a bit more on the Sikh army, for instance. But in terms of the periods of Sikh history, I've generally collated a lot of material, and sometimes it's all about putting it together in a way which is actually meaningful, I think. But I think, I've covered the Guru period with the Dasam Granth books, for instance. This particular book is pretty general in terms of what it covers, but I may go very specific based on what's happened in this book, because I've had a lot of feedback, including your great feedback, of course, today, and continuing feedback. But I've had a lot of feedback in terms of where I should be going next as well. So I'm thinking of this particular book as being one part of a journey of other kind of additional works which will possibly take place as well. So I think it's kind of leading, because it's suggesting to me this is the kind of areas that people want to read about.
Yeah, I would think so, definitely. And people like a bit of war and politics, and but for you keep yourself very busy, because you not only are you writing books, you've done exhibitions as well. I mean, do you like ever sleep? Do you relax?
Again, this just goes back to the testimony of what I've done in the past. If you have a certain percentage of knowledge of what you're going to be talking about, then it's add-ons, and then it's more about putting pieces together, if that makes sense. So when we did do the Anglo-Sikh Wars exhibition in 2017 here in Leicester, for instance, there was a lot of new information which I had to collate for it. We had to work with X amount of museums all across the UK to actually get relics and artifacts in as well from the actual battlefields. But more importantly, it was also like how do we actually change an exhibition? Now we actually have technological advances in there as well. So we incorporated, a 50-inch screen, touch screen, where you could actually, move 3D objects around. So we started looking at, how do we actually merge history with technology as well? Whilst this has started since 2015, we're able to put it in play in 2017. So the exhibition in 2017 was fascinating in the sense that it got global attention. Was it because of the subject, the Anglo-Sikh Wars, which is very, very an underrepresented area of British and Sikh history, or was it the technology? And it seems to suggest that focusing on all these areas seems to provide success, and it actually gives impetus for people to learn more, in whichever way you want to package it, essentially.
Yeah, so you're looking at all kinds of channels in which to share history with people, and I think it's fantastic. I really do, and I think the sort of virtual aspect of it, I love, and I think that's something definitely you should pursue. I hate doing this on my show because I end up telling people what to do, and it's terrible when I've got musicians who are very famous and authors who write books. I'm telling them what to do, but I think you've actually hit on something there, definitely with the virtual world. A lot of young people love touching the screens and moving people around, and I think it's a way of learning, which is it's a new way of learning, basically, right? So, so for your future plans as well, Gurinder, what I'm sure you've got things planned. I know you've got things bubbling away, and I'm sure COVID affected you as well. Have you got some exhibitions coming up, new books or new ventures?
Well, the existing project, which we started in 2018, is exactly that in terms of what you mentioned about the virtual. So we have the Anglo-Sikh Virtual Museum, which is live. I'll give the web address. It's www.anglosikhmuseum.com. And that is a repository of objects which have been recreated in 3D, starting from Guru Gobind Singh's period, going down into the Sikh Empire, for instance, and we're adding on objects every now and then. So we've got some great objects coming up in the next few weeks, but it's been trying to attract people using technology. So, I have got, say, the jewelry, which belonged to Safia Dalip Singh, who's a suffragette, but it was handed down from Maharaja Jindan Kaur, who was Maharaja Ranjit Singh's, consort. So it just shows you that even with the digital, we're not just talking about objects, we're talking about the history behind the object as well. So it kind of leads into different histories. So that's one of the projects we're still kind of completing. It's called the Anglo-Sikh Virtual Museum. And yes, there is a couple of books coming out based on the success of the British and the Sikhs as well. I've just kind of penned and inked a deal. I'm not going to give titles out at this particular moment, but that's been done as well. And depending on the environment, then we will have a look at if there's a forthcoming exhibition taking place as well. But in terms of lectures, the lectures are taking place. We're doing a lot of webinars all the time, weekly, monthly, they're all taking place. And, once the COVID situation is finished, then, we'll be back on the road again, doing digital showcases, taking out the 3D equipment out again and getting that engagement. It's not just engagement with the adults, it's engagement with the younger generation. It's actually making Sikh history palatable for people of all age ranges, but people of all faiths as well. It's not about just Sikh history in a little bubble, because that's the issue we've always had. Yeah. It's about making sure that the Sikh history is kind of shared widely with a wide range of group of people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think you're doing a very good job at it. And, Gino, we're coming towards the end. And you mentioned one of the all websites and links and your social media tags I'll put on the show notes anyway. But before you go, is there anything you want to say to anyone listening and watching in regards to Sikh history, or just history in general? Really, I think you're a history fan first and foremost, and then obviously you've written books on the Sikhs. But is there a message you have for anyone out there who may be interested in history, or maybe more likely not interested in history, and why they maybe should be?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key idea is never too late to learn as well. I think that's a really key thing. What in the UK, you go through school, college, uni, and then you stop reading. That's it. You stop. Your books are gone. You don't never read again. And the idea is to always be reading at least a little bit every day, because and then that way that engages your mind as well, makes you kind of prone to actually seeing a sense of the world, for instance. So I don't read fiction at all, hardly, but that's not to say you shouldn't read fiction, if that makes sense. So I'm gobbling up 10 books a week looking for facts and figures all the time. But I think what it is that if you have that bug, once you start that bug in terms of actually reading a little bit, it will hopefully lead you to reading other parts and other books as well. It doesn't have to be generally Sikh history. It could be any part of world history. And, we can have an event taking place today, I don't know, in world history. Google it. Just go on the website and read about it. If it tells you to purchase a book related to that event, then, you should do so. And I think that's what makes our people, would make our people a lot more stronger in terms of the educational background, because you got to remember that it was Guru Gobind Singh which originally brought this thought process out in terms of education. He invited all the Kavis or the Lakaris, so therefore the Sikh Khalsa during the time of Anand Prasad, for instance, was, the Darbar or royal court was based with educationalists, making translations of texts, for instance. And the key idea was, whilst you're warriors, you still need that educational background to put everything in perspective as well. So, you're not just warriors in isolation, you're hopefully warriors and understanding politics, medicine, other kind of therapies that help you in the battlefield, for instance. So all this education leads to other outcomes as well. So, sometimes when they say, the Sikhs don't have an educational system, the educational system was created by Guru Gobind Singh. Unfortunately, throughout the decades, etc., we've actually lost this. And I think we need to kind of come back to it in whichever way, form, or fashion this may be. Like I said, whether it's through books, reading history, through technology, showcases, it can be either way. Because like I said, right, going back from the start of the conversation, it's, it's whatever takes your fancy. But whatever does take your fancy, do try and read a bit more about it and delve into it. And, hopefully leads to a bit more success in people's actually understanding and, taking of this world knowledge that we have. Because Sikh history is a global knowledge. It's not a local knowledge. We should keep it local. Yeah. And that's what the messages of and the Bani of Guru Gobind Singh teaches us to do. It's a worldwide view which we have to keep in context.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as you mentioned, that Guru Gobind Singh, he surrounded himself by poets, musicians, and he loved the arts as well, right? So education was a massive part for him. And he's an accomplished poet himself, musician, warrior. I mean, what an amazing human being. It's unbelievable, just thinking about that. He could do so many things. But for people out there, you're right. I think we kind of put ourselves in a bubble. We're our own worst enemies almost, this is where we should look more into the context of, that world view and how we've affected, history, in the grand scale of things, and I think that's definitely apparent in the book. That's what I came out of it with. By reading this, I was thinking, wow, so we've these things happened, and that's what the ripple effect, the butterfly effect that you have, that small change, that small treaty, that small agreement by people affected this, and this, and almost the creation of the Sikh Empire. But also then the Sikh Empire then crumbled, and these are the sort of things behind it, and that which I found fascinating. I'm a new fan to history. I always was a bit of a history buff as well. But I am now. I think I want to know more about the Sikh history, and I think so. All in all, for your book, it is a pure success of what you hoped it would be.
Yeah, I think, like I said, the feedback's been absolutely fantastic. And again, across all groups as well, not just from Sikhs themselves, across all groups. And I'm getting emails from around the world. People saying how much they've really loved reading the book, and how easy it's been to read, similar to what you've said as well. But I just want to go back to one little thing, which was about Hoshiarpur, where we actually started at the start of this conversation. And interestingly, thing actually was his samadhi is actually in Hoshiarpur. It's in a place called Haryana. It's a small place, not Haryana, the state, but a place called Haryana. And there is where Bagil Singh is samadhi. So as part of the actual kind of research for this book, actually went there as well and was able to take a picture of the smile. And there's a Gurdwara there as well. So it just kind of shows you that, Sikh history is dotted all over the place in various locations. And again, if you're a field scholar, you can go and make these connections. But I thought that information would be useful for you. So if you're ever going back home, then you need to kind of, go to that location. I'm always willing to. In fact, a lot of people contact me when they're going to India, Pakistan, even saying, well, where should I go? Because I'm going here, but I want to go and do something else next as well. And, that also fits in with actually learning and actually experiencing, the rich culture of Punjab and the Sikh history as well.
Oh, yeah, without doubt. When the next time I'm going to be sending you a message, and I'm a keen photographer, as you may know, and I'll be there taking some pictures for sure. And look, Gurinder Singh Mann, it's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed this, and honestly, and please come on again when we've got something new ongoing. And like I said, I'll put all the links to your work on the podcast app notes, and this will be on YouTube as well, and we'll share it out. And for anyone listening, please do go get this book. It's fantastic. It really is. You will enjoy it, and I think we should always be learning more in life. Never stop learning. Like you said, when we got to a certain age, we stopped reading, didn't we? And I'll be honest with you, I did find it difficult at the beginning. I haven't read a book in a long time now, and it was a struggle at the beginning, but a little bit every day, and then you slowly getting into it, and it's reignited my passion for reading. So thank you, Gurinder, even for that. So
pleasure.
Okay, so that leads me to the end, Gurinder. So take care, and we'll speak real soon.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone who's watching this show. All the best.
Thank you.